Florida Paradise. Disrupted Florida, a state practically synonymous with vacation and leisure, sits at the southeastern tip of the United States, embraced by the gentle tides of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. With its subtropical climate, endless coastlines, and vibrant nightlife, Florida draws millions of visitors each year in pursuit of a dreamlike escape. The barrier islands and small keys, such as Shell Island, our fateful setting, shine like tiny emeralds scattered across the blue, attracting sun-seekers, thrill-seekers, and adventurers alike. The reputation of Florida as a paradise is woven from its postcard-perfect images: palm trees born to sway in the ocean breeze, cloudless skies painted in the soft pastels of dusk, and busy boardwalks alive with the sizzle of beachside food vendors. The waters, usually calm and inviting, shimmer a cool turquoise by day and mirror the golden-pink clouds come evening. Shell Island, relatively small and just an hour's boat ride from the mainland, remains a beloved secret among locals and those travelers craving the charm of a secluded retreat. White sand feels almost powdery underfoot. Tropical plants create green sanctuaries just off the shore, and dolphins sometimes leap playfully near the horizon. Year after year, groups of friends and wanderlust-driven tourists descend on this idyllic island, eager for lazy mornings in hammocks, afternoons spent snorkeling among coral gardens, and raucous beach parties that stretch into the early hours. Resorts and open-air bars dot the edge of the shore, promising relaxation and a taste of the exotic. For many, Shell Island offers both the glitter of social excitement and the promise of a peaceful escape from the world's troubles. However, beneath the postcard beauty, there is another reality, a tension that has quietly grown as visitors increase each season. Subtle changes have begun to ripple through the island community. Locals whisper about rising crime rates, the pressure of tourism on fragile ecosystems, and a simmering unease that the paradise veneer could crack at any moment. Some long-standing residents mutter that an island that depends so deeply on strangers' pleasure can easily become a stage for secrets, misunderstandings, or tragedy. The off-season, once sleepy and safe, now occasionally carries the unpredictable energy of summer's chaos, lingering just out of sight. In 2014, that tension broke through. A brutal, unexplained crime shattered the illusion of Shell Island as a safe haven. What was meant to be a familiar late summer celebration turned overnight into a nightmare, leaving an invisible chill on the tropical air. For the first time, the island's postcard landscape was splashed across national news, not for its beauty, but for the dark shadow cast over its sunlit beaches. And from that moment, visitors and locals alike would never see Shell Island, or the supposed safety of paradise, in quite the same way again. The night horror began. It was the night of September 15, 2014, and the air above Shell Island's western beach shimmered with the remnants of summer heat, only slightly tempered by a sluggish, salt-heavy breeze. The Blue Palm Bar, legendary among locals and visitors alike for its open deck, neon swing chairs and karaoke that went on until nearly dawn, was packed curb to sand with a swirl of American and British backpackers, local staff, and a smattering of seasoned regulars. Colored lanterns dangled from the tiki roof, swaying in rhythm with the live covers of 80s pop blaring from battered speakers. Emily Foster, newly graduated and world-wise well beyond her 22 years, held a blue cocktail aloft as she and her friends toasted to endless summers and fleeting romance. Her laughter rang out above the music as she swayed to the beat. Ben Carter, British and ever the gentleman despite his sunburn, jokingly challenged her to a limbo contest. Around them, the party was a wildfire, singing, messy dancing, barefoot games, strangers forming fast alliances over shared pitchers of margaritas, and the thrill of being utterly untethered. But beneath the festival glow, there were shadows stretching longer than anyone realized. Lifeguards doing double duty as nighttime bouncers eyed the back of the crowd, noting clusters of tourists pulling strangers aside for whispered conversations, laughter that was just a little too loud, pockets of tension flaring, maybe a quiet challenge over a game gone too far, a jealous glance between couples, the rare outsider whose eyes lingered too long. The local police, thinly spread across this narrow strip of land, drove lazy circles near the docks but seldom entered the wilder heart of these open-air beach gatherings unless summoned. As the party thinned out, the humidity pressed closer, coiling around the unwinding crowd. Sometime shortly after 3 in the morning, Emily and Ben were seen together at the end of the boardwalk, illuminated briefly by the flicker of a dying bonfire. Friends would later recall that both seemed relaxed, even exhilarated by the evening, eyes bright, voices just a bit hoarse from shouting over the music. No one, in the swirl of parting hugs and semi-drunken promises to message tomorrow, noticed as the two slipped away down an unlit path curving towards the quiet end of the beach. Their laughter faded into the hush of waves, lost to the fog rolling in off the Gulf, and the thudding bass receding behind them. Some would say later that the last hour before dawn always feels strangely haunted on Shell Island, when the revelers vanish, and the only sounds are the slow, greedy pull of the sea, and the skitter of crabs returning to their holes. On this particular night, a sense of unease hung heavy, thickened by the rumors that nothing ever happens here, until, suddenly, everything does. The night horror began. It was the night of September 15, 2014, and the air above Shell Island's western beach shimmered with the remnants of summer heat, only slightly tempered by a sluggish, salt-heavy breeze. The Blue Palm Bar, legendary among locals and visitors alike for its open deck, neon swing chairs and karaoke that went on until nearly dawn, was packed curb to sand with a swirl of American and British backpackers, local staff, and a smattering of seasoned regulars. Colored lanterns dangled from the tiki roof, swaying in rhythm with the live covers of 80s pop blaring from battered speakers. Emily Foster, newly graduated and world-wise well beyond her 22 years, held a blue cocktail aloft as she and her friends toasted to endless summers and fleeting romance. Her laughter rang out above the music as she swayed to the beat. Ben Carter, British and ever the gentleman despite his sunburn, jokingly challenged her to a limbo contest. Around them, the party was a wildfire, singing, messy dancing, barefoot games, strangers forming fast alliances over shared pitchers of margaritas, and the thrill of being utterly untethered. But beneath the festival glow, there were shadows stretching longer than anyone realized. Lifeguards doing double duty as nighttime bouncers eyed the back of the crowd, noting clusters of tourists pulling strangers aside for whispered conversations, laughter that was just a little too loud, pockets of tension flaring, maybe a quiet challenge over a game gone too far, a jealous glance between couples, the rare outsider whose eyes lingered too long. The local police, thinly spread across this narrow strip of land, drove lazy circles near the docks but seldom entered the wilder heart of these open-air beach gatherings unless summoned. As the party thinned out, the humidity pressed closer, coiling around the unwinding crowd. Sometime shortly after 3 a.m, Emily and Ben were seen together at the end of the boardwalk, illuminated briefly by the flicker of a dying bonfire. Friends would later recall that both seemed relaxed, even exhilarated by the evening, eyes bright, voices just a bit hoarse from shouting over the music. No one, in the swirl of parting hugs and semi-drunken promises to message tomorrow, noticed as the two slipped away down an unlit path curving towards the quiet end of the beach. Their laughter faded into the hush of waves, lost to the fog rolling in off the Gulf and the thudding bass receding behind them. Some would say later that the last hour before dawn always feels strangely haunted on Shell Island, when the revelers vanish and the only sounds are the slow, greedy pull of the sea and the skitter of crabs returning to their holes. On this particular night, a sense of unease hung heavy, thickened by the rumors that nothing ever happens here, until suddenly, everything does. A horrifying discovery at dawn. It was just after 6:30 a.m. when Linda Moreno, a local cleaning staff member at the Shell Island Beachside Resort, began her typical early morning shift. The horizon was a watercolor wash of gold and mauve, gulls cackling overhead, and the sand cool and untouched but for the footprints of crabs and a few early risers. Linda's route always took her from the marina, where fishing boats lolled lazily in their slips, down along the stretch of beach that connected several resorts and snack shacks. She liked these quiet hours, the island still sleepy, before tourists flooded the shore. But this morning, before she reached the far outcrops of rocks shielding the secluded side of the beach, Linda's routine was cruelly interrupted. She stumbled upon something that would forever split her life into before and after, a young woman's body, face partly obscured by wet hair, sprawled in the sand. The body was unnaturally still, limbs angular, skin pale beneath the rising sun. It took Linda a moment to process what she was seeing. Denial and dread crashed over her as she caught sight of another lifeless figure just a short distance away, a man, chest down, half submerged where the tide lazily licked the shore. Shaking, heart thudding, Linda fumbled her phone from her uniform and dialed 911. Within minutes, a patrol car and a paramedic unit made their way down the sandy service road as more resort staff, joggers and curious onlookers gathered in disbelief. The first responders cordoned off the scene with bright yellow tape, a grim pageantry among the sea oats and umbrellas left abandoned from the night before. News spread with the speed of rumor on a small island. By mid-morning, a helicopter ferried additional detectives over from the mainland, while a cluster of local officers attempted to keep frantic guests and shell-shocked staff at bay. Despite their efforts, some vital signs of evidence were lost as footprints, cigarette butts, and even clothing left behind by the victims were trampled or swept away by the mounting chaos. Photographers from Miami and Tampa arrived, their long lenses peering past the police barricades in hope of the next big headline. The crime scene itself was haunting. The female victim, later identified as Emily Foster, lay on the sand near the jagged rocks, her dress torn, her skin showing signs of both trauma and exposure. A few feet away, Ben Carter's body bore its own marks, bruises along his back and arms, blood-matted hair at the crown, clothing and a pair of sandals were scattered nearby. In the shifting morning light, officers noted a set of footprints, some deep and dragging, others sharp and hurried, interspersed with distinctive cigarette butts of a brand not sold locally. Among the reeds, a small, muddy shovel with streaks of blood was found, its handle warped, as if recently gripped with force. No eyewitnesses had seen or heard anything peculiar during the crucial overnight hours. Security cameras from nearby resorts showed little more than partygoers weaving along the boardwalk in the pre-dawn hours, while early morning swimmers, interviewed later, remembered only a sense of eeriness and the odd echoing silence as dawn broke. By the time the coroner arrived, the sun shimmered hotly over a transformed landscape, a crime scene that should have been a postcard, now marked with tape and the hushed shock of a community reeling from the reality that their paradise was no longer untouched by darkness. Shrouded lives, victims, and their mysterious backgrounds. Emily Foster's life played out like a lively novel, a young woman with a magnetic smile and a spirit as restless as the tides. Raised in the heart of New York City, she excelled both in academics and athletics, spending her teenage years alternating between high school robotics competitions and running along the East River at sunset. Her friends described her as endlessly curious, the type who asked probing questions, always carried a second camera to capture the overlooked moments, and had an uncanny ability to make strangers open up about their dreams or regrets. After graduation, Emily scrawled a list of places she longed to visit before entering the 9-to-5 world, a list topped by every beach with turquoise water. Florida became her first big solo leap, chosen for its blend of natural beauty and wild energy. Years earlier, a less tumultuous but equally driven life was unfolding thousands of miles away in Manchester, UK. Ben Carter was the steady hand among friends, the one to defuse a brewing fight or repair a broken surfboard with saltwater ingenuity. He was a civil engineer by training, his fascination with structures reflected in the way he appreciated the bones of old lighthouses, or the logic of a well-mapped hiking trail. Ben treasured stories about far-off places he'd never seen. When his circle planned their first American backpacking summer, Florida's islands, a compromise between adventure and relaxation, promised both challenge and charm. There was nothing outwardly sinister or remarkable about the pairing of Emily and Ben. They ran in parallel orbits on Shell Island for days, bumping into each other at beachfront volleyball matches, aquatic excursions, and lively dinners organized by hostel regulars. To onlookers, their connection felt serendipitous. Casual conversations about music and family grew into hidden confessions at dawn, laughter shared over greasy fries, and eventually, the sort of candid companionship that feels both novel and instantly comfortable. Yet in the wake of tragedy, even the simplest facts became threads for speculation. Emily's social media, brimming with photos, playful hashtags, and sunny captions, now seemed marked with cryptic undertones in the eyes of internet sleuths. Family members remembered a recent argument she'd had with an unknown caller. Ben, for his part, had deleted a string of emails shortly before the trip, an act his friends brushed off as spring cleaning but which now invited wild theories. Some speculated Emily might have stumbled onto something, perhaps overheard a secret on the island or become involved in a dispute outside her usual circles. Others wondered whether Ben's reserved nature hid deeper troubles or connections that had followed him across the Atlantic. Relatives and authorities alike struggled to separate rumor from reality. Emily's mother spoke to the press about her daughter's tenacity and empathy. Ben's sister clung to the memory of late-night calls after a hard day, describing her brother as incapable of malice. Both families, reeling in the media spotlight, were forced to confront how little anyone truly knows about a loved one's secret hopes and hidden anxieties. As details of their backgrounds trickled out, some fact, some speculation, the sense of mystery only deepened, casting long shadows over the crime that shattered paradise. Mysterious traces at the crime scene. From the moment investigators cordoned off the area that fateful morning, Shell Island's glistening shoreline became the backdrop for a labyrinth of confusion, speculation, and forensic inquiry. Meticulously combing over the battered section of beach, the investigative team was confronted by a swirl of contradictory signs and inexplicable evidence, each detail seeming to raise more questions than it answered. The condition of the victims' bodies was the first disturbing clue. Both Emily and Ben bore clear marks of a violent struggle: defensive wounds on their forearms and knuckles, patches of missing skin beneath Emily's fingernails, and a jagged gash on Ben's scalp as though struck with a heavy blunt object. Sand mingled with dried blood, further complicating scene reconstruction. Strange patterns had been pressed into the sand near the bodies, some wide and haphazard, others narrow and deliberate, as if an assailant or perhaps several people had hurriedly dragged or circled the fallen pair, leaving a tangled lattice of confusion. In addition to signs of physical violence, investigators noted the odd placement of the victims. Emily's body was partially shielded by large seaweed-draped rocks that jutted from the shore, while Ben lay only a few feet away, half submerged at the tide line. The configuration struck even seasoned detectives as unnervingly deliberate, as if someone had made a clumsy effort to hide Emily from view, but left Ben more exposed. A torn piece of blue fabric, later identified as part of Emily's dress, was wedged deep into the rocks, stained dark with brackish water and speckled with blood. Nearby, a small, mud-caked shovel drew immediate attention. Its handle was warped, slick with what appeared to be a combination of salt water and another reddish substance later confirmed to be blood. The shovel's blade bore hairline cracks, as if battered against stone, and tiny slivers of wood, possibly from its handle, were found embedded beneath Ben's fingernails. These fragments would become key exhibits, hinting at failed attempts by the victims to defend themselves. Forensic teams carefully bagged and tagged these items, hoping that painstaking analysis might reveal either fingerprints or a DNA trace not belonging to Emily or Ben. Yet it was the sheer diversity of footprints that confounded everyone involved. Dozens of impressions marred the sand, some deep, indicating rapid force or weight, others so faint they threatened to vanish under the midday sun. Patterns suggested at least 3 different shoe types, one set small and narrow, perhaps belonging to a woman, another large and heavy-treaded, more likely a man's, the third slipper-like, its tread nearly smooth. A lone set of bare footprints trailed away southeast, shadowed by broad drag marks, as if someone had attempted to carry or pull a heavy load toward the underbrush. Police cast molds of these footprints, but shifting tides ensured the full story was lost within hours. Adding to the enigma, scattered cigarette butts dotted the scene, some partially buried in the sand. Forensic analysis would later reveal genetic material from at least 2 individuals besides the victims, troubling since only a handful of locals smoked the brand in question, and none matched the DNA profiles gleaned from bar receipts that night. Surrounding the scene, faint traces of shoe polish and a torn hotel keycard suggested hurried movement, or perhaps a fight stretching between the sand and the resort walkways. The keycard belonged to a vacant room, checked out days earlier by a guest under a false name. Cross-referencing guest lists and entry logs became a vital lead, if not a frustratingly broad one. Most unsettling, perhaps, was a single silver locket, half buried near the grass line, pried open to reveal a faded photograph and initials not corresponding to either victim. The locket, smeared with sand and what proved to be sunscreen residue, sparked rampant speculation. Was it dropped by the murderer, a passing witness, or simply by accident days before the crime? Although it was swabbed for fingerprints, only an indistinct partial print could be recovered, insufficient for immediate identification but enough to fuel a storm of wild rumor online and among the island's residents. Throughout the investigation, beach towels, abandoned shoes, and plastic cups from the previous evening's parties muddled the search for relevant clues. Detectives had to carefully piece together what belonged to the chaotic nightlife and what might constitute evidence. A set of sunglasses, broken and left beside Emily's hand, was tentatively matched to a bar photograph showing her wearing them earlier in the night. A gold hoop earring discovered half-buried some 12 feet away initially appeared nondescript, until Emily's closest friend confirmed it was Emily's, though she always wore both as a set. The second earring was never recovered, its absence sparking further debate as to whether it represented a trophy for the killer, a clue lost in the struggle, or simply a detail overlooked in the sweep. Adding to the challenge, the restless coastal elements played their own adversarial role. By the time the coroner and forensic specialists arrived, much of the tide had already washed away subtle blood streaks and confounded time-of-death estimation. Birds and small animals common on Shell Island could have further disturbed the arrangement of clothing and small personal effects. Officers combed the area for hours, recovering a single wallet. Ben's, found open and damp in the undergrowth, the cash and identification intact. To the relief of his family, no sign of theft suggested robbery as a motive, but the unease of unaccounted movement on the island only grew deeper. Several unopened text messages on Ben's cell phone, recovered near his body with a cracked screen, appeared to have been sent after 4:00 a.m., an hour after witnesses last saw him alive. Who sent these messages and why remained a disquieting mystery. The canvas forensics tent became a hub of intense activity as specialists dusted fragments for prints, packaged fibers, and meticulously logged every cigarette butt, footprint, or scrap of fabric as potential evidence. The incongruous mix of tourist detritus and possible crime scene material formed a puzzle with no clear boundaries, and every new piece seemed only to deepen the riddle enfolding Shell Island, raising the chilling specter that what had occurred in the darkness was far more complicated than the simple result of a summer party gone awry. Police on Shell Island, caught between pressure. The Shell Island Police Department, a modest force more accustomed to traffic violations and the occasional bar brawl than to grisly murder investigations, found themselves at the eye of a media storm after the shocking events of that September morning. Overnight, the tranquil island was transformed. Patrol cars, usually reserved for festival traffic, now idled at every intersection, their lights flashing as officers cordoned off the beaches and side streets. The once carefree boardwalk bustled not with laughter and sunburnt tourists, but with clusters of uniformed officers, huddled journalists, and anxious resort staff straining for any scrap of news. The department's resources were immediately stretched thin. Chief Marissa Cullen, a level-headed law enforcement veteran with decades of service in small-town Florida, woke to find her office phone ringing persistently and her inbox brimming with requests from local politicians, county officials, and panicked hotel owners concerned for their livelihoods. Her team comprised only a dozen permanent officers, many of whom had never handled a crime scene more complicated than a purse snatching. The swift escalation of the case quickly overwhelmed their routines and procedures. The first crucial hours after the bodies were found saw the local police scrambling to secure evidence, set up a temporary command post at the beachside marina, and coordinate with the sheriff's department on the mainland. But their approach was soon tested by the flood of outside influences. Within a day, detectives from the county, FBI consultants, and even the Coast Guard began arriving, each bringing their own agendas and conflicting methods. The once unified island response became a delicate dance. Local officers, wary of appearing incompetent, tried to assert jurisdiction, while the more experienced mainland operatives eyed every move with skepticism. Meanwhile, the eyes of the world fell on Shell Island. Television vans jammed the little parking lots, their satellite dishes pointed skyward, reporters rehearsing sound bites in the morning glare. News helicopters loitered overhead, their rotors a constant, agitating hum. Chief Cullen found herself giving terse statements at hastily organized press conferences, careful to reveal little of substance while combating rumors that spread faster than even she could track. Gossip swirled through Facebook groups, WhatsApp chains, and the island's own rumor mills. Wild stories of misdeeds, some rooted in fact, many utterly false, sprouted in the absence of certainty. Tourists, many on the last leg of their summer vacations, grew frustrated with the sudden quarantine of the island. Officers were posted at every ferry dock and private boat slip. No one was permitted to depart Shell Island without first undergoing questioning and a cursory search. The local population, fiercely proud of their tight-knit community, bristled at the implication that one of their own could be responsible for such brutality, yet clamored for decisive police action, lest the entire economy collapse under the pall of suspicion. Within PD headquarters, a drab two-room facility tucked behind the firehouse, the pressure mounted with each passing hour. Burge, a newly minted officer barely 24 and used to the steady rhythm of vacation season, found himself running fingerprints, logging evidence bags, and fielding calls from shell-shocked parents of the victims. Detective Leung, the department's lone forensic specialist, worked 20-hour shifts, hunched over borrowed microscopes, cataloging fabric scraps and foreign objects pulled from the sand. The phone lines never stopped, missing persons queries, angry business owners demanding full reopenings, and radio chatter from the sheriff's department offering unsolicited advice. Island police, ill-prepared for crisis communication, stumbled at times. A press release was leaked to the media before key family members had been notified of Emily and Ben's deaths, sparking international outrage. Another blunder saw a key section of beach reopened for several hours due to a clerical mix-up, potentially compromising further evidence. At every turn, even the most basic functions, securing a perimeter, controlling crowds of onlookers, processing a tidal wave of evidence, became a logistical nightmare. Inside the command center, maps of the island, usually hung for hurricane evacuation drills, were quickly repurposed with pins and string to trace movements of both suspects and potential witnesses. Index cards and photographs carpeted every available surface. Tensions flared further as state and federal agencies insisted on following strict chain-of-custody protocols, often clashing with seasoned local cops who were more accustomed to resolving matters by instinct and face-to-face interviews. At night, Chief Cullen met with her most trusted deputies, trying to chart a path forward between the needs of the investigation and the rising panic of Shell Island's residents. The human element only compounded matters. Some younger officers, emotionally unprepared for the violence on display, suffered insomnia and anxiety attacks. Others, especially those with family members employed in the tourism industry, were accused of leaking updates to their friends or relatives, jeopardizing the integrity of the case. Resort security teams, who formed the first line of defense against intrusive photographers and desperate guests, sometimes found themselves at odds with police instructions. With every misstep, national media outlets pounced, hinting at an island-wide conspiracy or alleging incompetence. Interagency communication proved just as thorny. Email servers crashed routinely, overwhelmed by the volume of incoming queries and legal requests. Temporary workarounds, sticky notes, word-of-mouth warnings, and stacks of handwritten field reports became the norm. The digital forensic unit that arrived from Miami was appalled to discover that Shell Island's police operated with paper logbooks and a single functional security server. This gap delayed crucial cross-referencing between suspect alibis, surveillance footage, and guest registries. Amidst the chaos, the smallest lapses produced outsized consequences. Officers manning roadblocks lost track of which vehicles had already been searched, leading to redundant interrogations and fraying tempers. When a local bar owner attempted to wipe his outdoor camera, insisting he was protecting guest privacy, investigators nearly lost a key portion of time-stamped footage. A frantic attempt to back up every available scrap of digital evidence required borrowed laptops and volunteers from among the island's few resident IT workers. One machine overheated mid-upload, risking the loss of hours of painstakingly collected data. Community relations, usually a point of pride on Shell Island, deteriorated by the day. Residents grumbled about the heavy police presence and the persistent accusatory questioning. Well-meaning volunteers descended on the police station with tips or rumors, overwhelming dispatch, and often muddying the real leads. Tensions reached a fever pitch when, several nights after the murder, a crowd gathered outside the station demanding answers and accountability. Some carried candles, others waved hastily scrawled signs, a few shouted conspiracy charges over bullhorns. Officers, some shaken, others defiant, stood guard outside, blinking wearily in the glare of phone cameras and news team floodlights. In private, Chief Cullen confided to her closest ally on the force that she felt the case would mark a turning point for Shell Island, for better or worse. Never before had outside scrutiny been so intense, or the simple act of policing so fraught with doubt and public anger. She barely slept, her mind cycling through details of botched perimeter checks and unreturned forensic test results, haunted as much by the thought of letting a murderer walk free as by the possibility of condemning an innocent resident. As the investigation dragged on, the fatigue, frustration, and uncertainty seemed to infect every layer of island life. Officers rotated through 12-hour shifts, eating vending machine snacks between interviews, swigging lukewarm coffee under constant surveillance from the media. The police department's once cordial relationships with hospitality workers and business owners fractured into suspicion and accusation, every favor now perceived as potential corruption, every mistake seized on as evidence of a cover-up. Years later, Those who served on the Shell Island police force during the infamous investigation would remember not just the horror of the crime itself, but the suffocating atmosphere in its aftermath. It was a dark initiation, a grim education in the complexities of high-profile cases, where the greatest challenge often was not only catching a killer, but surviving the pressure and paranoia that came with the eyes of the world trained on Paradise laid bare. Primary suspects, an initial investigation. From the earliest days of the Shell Island investigation, the air was thick with suspicion. As the shockwaves of the crime reverberated across the island, police scrambled to identify suspects within a growing web of potential motives, concealed hostilities, and the usual transient traffic that washes up on any popular resort. Locals, shaken by the brutality and notoriety, whispered about new faces and old feuds, while the authorities struggled to turn rumor and conjecture into something resembling a concrete lead. Detectives faced an overwhelmingly complex challenge. The island's population nearly tripled in peak season, combining local workers, foreign service staff, backpackers, and an ever-shifting crowd of short-term renters. On the morning after the murders, officers began by isolating the last people known to have interacted with the victims. Resort registration logs, bar tabs, social media check-ins, and mobile phone locations were all pored over by an exhausted task force. Any staff member whose shift overlapped with the party or who had been seen near the western beach was brought in for questioning. The frenzied early investigation spanned multiple languages and cultures. The island boasted a cosmopolitan service community with immigrant workers from Cuba, Haiti, the Bahamas, and more, as well as a bustling flow of international guests. A few early potential suspects emerged from circumstance and stereotype. Foreign kitchen workers living in cramped quarters near the docks faced more than a little xenophobic suspicion. From certain locals, from law enforcement stretched thin and under pressure, and from a media quick to seize upon any hint of narrative. Police swept hostels and staff housing, methodically collecting DNA samples from over 200 individuals over a fraught 48-hour period. Bar managers and resort security officers bristled at the disruption, while many staff, fearing retaliation or deportation, clammed up or left the island altogether before they could be properly questioned. The investigation zeroed in on two key groups: foreign service staff who might have crossed paths with the victims and close companions of Emily and Ben, especially those whose stories held inconsistencies. Among the waves of interrogations, the name Josh surfaced quickly, a longtime friend traveling with Ben who had sustained injuries to his hand during the wild party. Speculation buzzed in the air, and several bystanders offered up dubious stories. A pair of local fishermen reported seeing a tall, nervous man lurking in the dunes, while a young bartender recounted a drunken argument over a missing phone that escalated and then abruptly fizzled out. Each lead produced fresh uncertainty rather than clarity. Josh's hand was quickly scrutinized, the result of a slipped bottle during a limbo contest, he insisted. DNA analysis confirmed that his blood was not present at the scene. He was quietly cleared, but the ripple of suspicion fanned out to others in the friend group. Some of Ben's acquaintances from his hostel couldn't recall their full movements between midnight and sunrise. Gaps in their stories, compounded by alcohol and the fragmented nature of the party, made reconstructing an accurate timeline excruciatingly difficult. Others contradicted each other outright, muddling the narrative further. As the hours dragged on, detectives turned their focus toward employees from a nearby Cuban-owned restaurant, many of whom had been working late or cleaning up as the party wound down. Two workers in particular attracted attention, partially due to their absence at roll call the day the bodies were found and partially due to their proximity to the crime scene as determined by security video footage. Rumors swirled among the local staff. One claimed to have overheard a heated exchange in Spanish between one of the workers and a group of intoxicated tourists earlier that night. This thread quickly developed into a full-blown investigation, and both restaurant workers were taken in for questioning as their DNA samples were expedited for analysis. Meanwhile, police found themselves mired in a mounting pile of physical and digital evidence. Cell phones from dozens of partygoers were confiscated and processed. The forensics team attempted to match text messages, GPS pings, and photos with the evolving party timeline. Security footage proved limited, though the Blue Palm Bar had cameras, outage gaps, poor lighting, and heavy traffic rendered most recordings inconclusive. The few usable frames showed Emily and Ben leaving the bar together around 3 a.m., with no clear sign of anyone following. No other cameras on the beach boardwalk or in nearby resort entrances, picked up a matching pair. Investigators faced a maze of conflicting witness statements. Some claimed to have seen a group of strangers at the edge of the party, keeping mostly to themselves and watching the revelry with sullen expressions. Others insisted they saw Emily arguing with someone unfamiliar, but descriptions varied: tall, short, bearded, clean-shaven. None of the images quite matched up. Alcohol and adrenaline had clouded memories. Some witnesses admitted they had left the party before midnight, only realizing something was wrong when police arrived at their hotel doors in the morning. Leads from the physical evidence remained maddeningly fragmented. Several sets of footprints of varying sizes and patterns mapped a chaotic scene, with at least 3 distinct shoe types present. The mysterious shovel found near the bodies yielded partial prints, but its generic make and wide availability stymied quick identification. Cigarette butts found at the scene tested positive for DNA, but at that point in the season, dozens on the island favored the same imported brand, which blurred the suspect pool rather than narrowing it. In the midst of this confusion, local anxiety and outside scrutiny only increased. Tensions simmered between the local police and specialized outside investigators flown in from the mainland. Disagreements over priorities and tactics sometimes erupted in front of shell-shocked family members. The families of the victims, desperate for answers and frustrated by the lack of progress, hired private investigators and attorneys of their own. A move that further complicated cooperation between authorities and witnesses. News crews from Miami, Tampa, and even the UK crowded ferry docks and resort parking lots. Rumors circulated online that the police were sitting on a confession, that an island cult was involved, or that organized crime was behind the slayings. Grief and suspicion collided as the official suspect list swelled, then shrank, and then ballooned again with each passing day. All the while, local authorities worked under the mounting pressure of the resort industry, which feared a collapse in tourism. The unspoken hope that the murderer was a transient outsider, not a longtime islander, drove much of the unofficial investigation, with the police department eager to avoid scapegoating without proof, even as the community demanded someone to blame. Within a week, the DNA samples from the 2 Cuban restaurant workers came back. To the surprise of investigators, worn down by stress and public speculation, their DNA matched samples lifted from cigarette butts and from skin and hair found on the victims. Under intense interrogation, both men confessed to an altercation with the victims, describing a heated and tragic escalation. But as word of the confessions filtered into the public sphere, skepticism arose. Civil rights attorneys and even some detectives pointed out inconsistencies and apparent exploitation of language barriers during questioning. The men's accounts did not entirely match with trace evidence, and certain elements, such as the recovered silver locket and the time-stamped messages on Ben's phone, remained unresolved and unexplained. The initial investigation, meant to deliver closure, instead threw open new doors of doubt. Many locals and outside observers grew convinced that, whether or not the detained workers were complicit, much about the case remained hidden in the shadows of Shell Island. With possible leads still unresolved, an atmosphere of both relief and deep unease settled over the once idyllic paradise, and everyone, police, residents, and grieving families alike, wondered whether the truth had truly surfaced, or if it still lay buried beneath the shifting sands. Camera data and image clues. Throughout the high-pressure investigation, the role of video surveillance and photographic evidence became a focal point for both authorities and the ever-growing contingent of outside experts. On Shell Island, the prevalence of resort, boardwalk, and bar security cameras gave police the critical, yet often unreliable, digital eyes needed to reconstruct the critical hours surrounding the murders. The task was anything but simple. Footage was scattered across dozens of privately managed systems, each with different storage protocols, image qualities, and security policies. Detectives began by systematically requesting and collecting all possible video recordings from the night before the bodies were discovered. This meant navigating the sensitivities of resort owners who were reluctant to surrender guest privacy, and tech-challenged bar managers, some of whom hadn't properly maintained their systems for months due to complacency or technical trouble. The Blue Palm Bar, last seen as the epicenter of the victims' night out, had 4 outdoor cameras pointed at the deck, entrance, and sidewalk. 2 of these were found to be non-functional due to a summer thunderstorm. The remaining 2 yielded grainy, off-angle footage with patchy sound. Even so, the first usable video showed Emily and Ben weaving through the crowd, laughing, arms draped around each other's shoulders, at approximately 2:56 a.m. They paused at the end of the deck, where Emily fished out her phone and snapped a selfie by the tiki lanterns. A snippet later confirmed by her unlocked Instagram account. At 3:07 a.m., the footage captured them leaving the main boardwalk, cutting through the side gate toward a quieter stretch of dunes. A few minutes later, the camera's view was briefly obscured by a large group departing en masse. No other clear image of the pair appeared on camera after that, prompting police to believe the two intentionally sought privacy or were lured away. Further investigation of videos from nearby businesses proved vexing. The Rodriguez convenience store, located near the primary beach access, offered a camera that faced part of the parking lot and boardwalk. But the tape suffered from digital artifacting and time-stamping issues caused by a leap-year glitch. The internal clock lagged by nearly 90 minutes. Investigators, aided by IT volunteers, cross-referenced visible light patterns, building shadows and guest vehicles to align footage with the confirmed timeline. This process illuminated one key detail: a silver compact car, headlights off, lingering at the far corner of the lot from 3:11 to 3:23 a.m. The car's owner was never definitively identified, though a local lifeguard recalled seeing an unfamiliar sedan leaving hastily just before dawn. Surveillance from Sweetwater Resort's beachfront towers proved similarly frustrating. Most cameras captured only empty corridors, dimly lit lobby space, and the distant edge of sand, little more than pale forms flickering across the field of vision. However, one motion-activated camera triggered at 3:14 a.m., registering a shadowy figure running along the dune path away from the direction of the murder site. The running form's dimensions suggested a man of above-average height, but low resolution and dense morning fog muddled further analysis. The figure never passed through the main lobby, indicating either a local shortcut or knowledge of the less-traveled footpaths that crisscrossed the island. Meanwhile, police scoured local hotel and hostel footage, focusing on potential witness movements and anyone who might have trailed Emily and Ben that night. Most of these recordings offered nothing of consequence. The lobby of Palm Coast Hostel was deserted between 3 and 4, aside from the receptionist watching late-night television. The security feed from a neighboring seafood shack, whose camera pointed at the delivery alley, was largely obstructed by a delivery truck left overnight, except for a fleeting moment at 3:16 a.m. when a slender figure, possibly female, hurried across the frame carrying what appeared to be a purse or bag. Investigators attempted to enhance the image, but even with assistance from the County Crime Lab's analytics team, the object's details and the person's facial features eluded clarity. One seemingly invaluable find came from a tourist named Rachel Delaney, who was out early that morning combing the beach for shells with her phone's camera set to time-lapse mode. Reviewing the photos, police noticed in the background of several shots, time-stamped between 3:20 and 3:30 a.m., blurry silhouettes moving rapidly along the breakers. One image in particular showed two figures locked in what could have been an embrace or a struggle, several yards from a patch of tall grass near where the bodies were discovered hours later. Digital forensics carefully extracted positional data from Rachel's phone, plotting the scene's geography in 3D to provide context for subsequent search efforts. With the mounting pressure from media and the victims' families, the Shell Island Police invited FBI support for image enhancement. Federal technicians applied advanced noise reduction, edge detection, and color correction algorithms on the amassed footage. The results were a mixed blessing. The faces captured in bar and boardwalk videos stayed indistinct, elusive, a blend of party detritus and fleeting glances. But several key observations emerged. The silver compact car in the convenience lot was momentarily illuminated when a figure, tall, wearing a dark hoodie, opened its trunk before driving off. Elsewhere, the running man on the dune path was seen glancing over his shoulder, as if checking for pursuers. For the first time, police considered that the crime might involve more parties or a coordinated escape than previously believed. Photo evidence also arrived via less traditional means. Social media scavengers, amateur sleuths trawling Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat, unearthed a handful of videos and selfies posted from the island in the fateful overnight window. Some clips featured partygoers in the Blue Palm bragging about the best summer ever, inadvertently capturing strangers in the bokeh-laden background. Detective Leung painstakingly mapped each post's metadata against the timeline, searching for faces that might reappear, yet every time a promising lead surfaced, it seemed to dead-end in anonymity or visual ambiguity. A point of frustration lay in the analysis of digital image signatures and timestamps. A few photographic files submitted by tourists showed evidence of possible tampering, Their EXIF data revealed timestamp edits and poorly executed attempts to crop out portions of the frame. Debate erupted in the detective's room. Had someone attempted to obscure their presence on the beach? Or were these merely the amateur efforts of visitors wanting to enhance souvenirs and spare themselves embarrassment online? The police sought corroborating raw files, but some devices, especially disposable digital or old GoPro models, had been dipped in seawater and suffered irreversible data loss. Broken or missing cameras remained another puzzle. At least one camera belonging to the Sunrise Beach cottages, directly overlooking the stretch where the crime occurred, had been reported out for maintenance for several days prior to the incident. Several police and civilian cyber forensics consultants speculated that this absence might be deliberate sabotage, perhaps orchestrated by someone with technical knowledge or inside access. The resort's owner, surly and uncooperative, denied any involvement yet faced harsh scrutiny as the news traveled online, giving rise to whispered conspiracy theories among residents and journalists. In addition to official surveillance and tourist footage, physical photographic clues emerged from the crime scene itself. Among the sand and sea oats, detectives located a partially buried disposable camera. Its role, when developed, mostly documented hazy daylight beach scenes and boisterous group photos. However, the final exposures on the strip were dark, grainy, flash-lit shots that appeared accidental. A boot in the foreground, a hurried blur of movement, and one image of a man's outstretched hand, and what appeared to be a blue fabric, later compared forensically to Emily's torn dress. The owner of the camera was never identified, prompting rumors that it might have belonged to one of the victims, a bystander, or even the perpetrator intent on memorializing the act or sending a message. Meanwhile, image forensics teams scrutinized every visible surface in old and new shots for overlooked clues, reflections in sunglasses, wristwatches, or smartphone screens. One such anomaly, a mirrored pair of sunglasses recovered near the site, contained a faint, ghostly reflection of two unknown individuals standing close together on the beach, their faces ambiguous but frames time-stamped near the known window of the crime. Frustration grew as the hours of video footage, thousands of stills, and digital artifacts failed to yield a smoking gun. Yet, every marginal detail, a staggered gait, the angle of a car door, a shadow inconsistent with the rest, was scrutinized anew, feeding both the investigative obsession and the public's appetite for answers. The labyrinth of camera data became a case study in both the promise and limitation of modern surveillance, compounding the sense that technology, while omnipresent, could only reveal so much about what truly took place on that fateful night. The surprising confession of the suspect. The interview room at the Shell Island Police Department was a study in tension and exhaustion, aged walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, and the thick air of unresolved violence. Two Cuban immigrants, Manuel Ortega and Luis Martinez, both kitchen workers from a popular beachfront restaurant, sat opposite a cluster of police officers and translators. Their faces revealed a blend of fear, resignation, and confusion as the wheels of American justice rolled into high gear. Both men had been taken in under shadows of suspicion. Their proximity to the crime scene, irregular hours, and a series of witness tips made them targets almost from the outset. The confessions, when they came, were not the dramatic showdowns so often rendered in television thrillers. Rather, each man's words unfolded piecemeal after long, grueling hours. The result, some would argue, of fatigue and overwhelming duress as much as guilt. Initial police statements described the encounter as emotional and contradictory, with Manuel crumpling under the weight of interrogation first. He admitted to being on the western beach around the estimated time of the murders, reportedly searching for a misplaced wallet after a late shift. His recollection was fragmented, stress and poor English mixed with the nervous glances he exchanged with the translators. He claimed to have encountered Emily and Ben, and, provoked by a heated argument whose origins were never clearly explained, struck Ben in a moment of panic. Manuel's memory blurred further at the edges. He insisted he had no intention to kill anyone, and suffered fits of tears as he was pressed for details about Emily's fate. "It happened so fast," he repeated, eyes darting as if searching for rescue or absolution in the sterile room. Luis, on the other hand, maintained longer stretches of defiant silence, at times answering only in monosyllables through the interpreter. According to official transcripts, he admitted to being nearby, but initially denied any direct confrontation. When confronted with a match between his DNA, found on a cigarette butt near the scene and under Ben's fingernails, and the forensic evidence, Luis's composure faltered. He finally admitted to intervening in the altercation, allegedly trying to break things up, though his account was inconsistent about when, how, and why Emily was discovered injured on the sand. The confessions were, in many ways, mirrors of the chaos on Shell Island itself, messy, full of contradictions, and suspended between truth and fear. The police, keen to close the book on a double homicide rattling the island's core, accepted the confessions as breakthroughs. Yet within hours, cracks formed in the story. Civil liberties lawyers, alerted first by local immigrant advocates and then by national media, denounced what they called a rushed and coercive process. Allegations surfaced that the confessions had been obtained after marathon interrogations exceeding recommended limits, with insufficient rest, legal consultation, or cultural sensitivity. Translator records hinted at missed nuances or errors. Some phrases attributed to Manuel or Luis, crucial admissions of guilt, were later described as mistranslations or pressured agreement to avoid perceived violence or deportation. Soon the prosecution's case, while appearing strong on the surface, began to fray under close inspection. Neither man had a prior history of violence. Witness timelines failed to converge. Several key resort staff insisted they saw both suspects back at their staff housing much earlier than the estimated time of death. The origins of the heated argument purportedly sparking the attack were never verified, nor could investigators establish with certainty that Emily and Ben had ever interacted with the two men prior to the incident. Social media analysis yielded no photos, texts, or messages tying the two groups together. Most troubling for the defense were the lingering forensic ambiguities. While DNA samples from the crime scene suggested contact, there was no evidence either man possessed the distinctive cigarette brand found at the site. The locket containing a stranger's photo, the muddy shovel, and the discarded hotel keycard, items forming the mystery's backbone, eluded plausible connection to Manuel or Luis. Notably, neither suspect's fingerprints matched those found on the ornate silver locket, nor could either explain the enigmatic posthumous text messages recovered from Ben's phone. Attempts to reconstruct Laura and Manuel's movements, from handset GPS and ferry logs, only heightened confusion. There were several unexplained gaps, hours when both men could not convincingly account for their whereabouts, yet lacked firm placement at the crime scene. In the midst of the mounting uncertainty, local and international press seized upon the confessions with skepticism. Why would two men, with little demonstrable motive and no history of criminal behavior, risk everything to commit an act of brutal violence against strangers who, according to evidence, barely crossed their paths? Online theorists proposed several alternatives. The real killer might have leveraged Manuel and Luis as unwilling scapegoats. Maybe their confessions masked a deeper conspiracy involving other guests or locals avoiding suspicion. Some speculated about undercurrents of xenophobia or political expediency pushing authorities to secure fast results, especially under the glare of tourism officials, resort owners, and politicians desperate to restore the island's reputation. On the island itself, the confessions divided public sentiment. Old-timers who prided themselves on welcoming outsiders voiced frustration that suspicion had landed on newcomers simply seeking steady work and anonymity. The Cuban immigrant community, already wary from years of cultural marginalization, organized vigils and petitions. Meanwhile, some residents clung to the official story, insisting that closure was better than enduring uncertainty and anxiety beneath the summer sun. Back inside the police department, detectives struggled with their own doubts. The evidence chain was weaker than expected. Scenarios reconstructed with the confessions never fully explained the tangled footprints or the missing earring. Detective Leung spent sleepless nights reviewing time-stamped images, voice logs, and transcript minutiae, hunting for a thread that would either exonerate or implicate the suspects more surely. Each time he surveyed the physical exhibits, the shovel, the half-empty wallet, the cigarette butts, the keycard, he wondered what idyllic or sinister hands had set the crime in motion. For Manuel and Luis, the aftermath of their confessions was consumed by confusion and despair. Both men were held without bail, their requests for further legal help mired in bureaucracy and language delays. Interviews with public defenders soon revealed fresh details, including statements that the pair had never met Emily or Ben before the night in question, nor did they know each other particularly well outside of work. Manuel claimed his only clear memory was of running away from the beach after seeing something he couldn't explain, while Luis maintained he was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. In haunting late-night cell recordings, both voiced their fear that the truth, whatever it was, might never come to light. The legal machinery ground on relentlessly. Advocates called for a full review of all translated interrogation statements and the cross-examination process. Defense teams demanded additional DNA testing and re-evaluation of digital evidence, pushing to reconstruct timelines with geolocation forensics. As weeks spilled into months, revelations from inside the investigation complicated public and private opinion. Pressure to deliver a suspect, the logistical nightmares of multi-agency cooperation, and the fundamental question of whether language and fear had condemned two innocent men. The victims' families, desperate for both answers and justice, found themselves torn, yearning for closure yet disturbed by the shape it appeared to be taking. What emerged in the end was not resolution, but a deeper, more uncomfortable mystery. The suspects' confessions, unexpected, contradictory, and shadowed by doubt, became another haunting chapter in Shell Island's ongoing legend. They offered no clear path back to peace, only a reminder that truth, sometimes, is the most elusive of all the island's treasures. Victims' families, public opinion, and international community. The days following the Shell Island tragedy felt surreal, a hazy blend of grief, anger, bureaucracy, and the dizzying onrush of a media maelstrom. For Emily Foster's and Ben Carter's families, the news hit like a sudden riptide, dragging them from their familiar routines into a waking nightmare. One minute, they were sending cheerful texts and making vacation jokes from thousands of miles away. The next, they faced foreign police, language barriers, cryptic autopsy reports, and a world suddenly hungry for every detail of their children's last hours. Emily's mother, Susan Foster, landed in Florida within 24 hours, her face ashen behind oversized sunglasses, clutching a folder of family photos. She met hurriedly with local police, journalists trailing her every step. For Susan, the trip was part agony, part performance, grieving in public, fielding questions no parent should ever have to answer, her statements dissected by cable news anchors for signs of steady nerves or repressed rage. Next came the Carters, Ben's parents and sister flying in from the UK, clutching each other in airport hallways while flashbulbs popped. Ron Carter, himself a stoic former technician, surprised many by taking the lead in press interviews. His grief was quieter, but his demand for answers was relentless. Ben was a builder, a problem solver, he declared. We need to know what happened, not just for us, but so no one else ever suffers this way. Quickly, the story of two promising young lives lost abroad outgrew the island. News vans ringed the narrow ferry terminal, blockading the former paradise. Journalists jostled for position, armed with research on both families, trending hashtags, and the sort of practiced solemnity only seen when tragedy goes viral. British, American, and international correspondents scoured social media for tributes, piecing together Emily and Ben's lives from tagged photos and old interviews. Every post, every tagged friend, every carefully crafted word was pored over for some hint of warning, some lesson to extract from senseless violence. The Fosters and Carters found themselves at the storm's center. Even as the police briefed them behind closed doors, producers and reporters camped outside their hotels seeking comment. Family spokespersons gave carefully worded updates, oscillating between hope for justice and bitter condemnation of the investigation's halting pace. Support came pouring in, dozens of floral arrangements, handwritten letters, crowdfunding campaigns to cover the logistical nightmare of post-mortem transatlantic flights and mounting legal fees. But support was mixed with suspicion. On cable news and in online forums, theories flourished. Was there a cover-up to protect the local tourism industry? Why had the island police released so little hard information? Had the victims been targeted, or was it a random explosion of violence? Think pieces called the shell-shocked families cinematic, parsing their gestures for drama or deception. Susan, always the private parent, found herself dissected for signs of composure or hysteria. Ron was accused in one viral post of being too controlled, as if grief had a universally approved script. International outrage was swift. In London, vigils sprang up outside the U.S. Embassy. American college campuses, where Emily had once debated and volunteered, staged memorials and silent walks. Politicians in both countries called for travel warnings or temporary blacklists. Florida's tourism officials rushed to perform damage control, touting new security measures and pledging full transparency, a promise swiftly undermined by conflicting statements from island officials and the now embattled Shell Island police chief. Newsrooms in Miami, New York, and London coordinated coverage, sending investigative teams who rented beachfront condos and staked out every bar and police press conference. Headlines blared "Paradise Lost" and "Washed in Blood," snap judgments that did little to comfort the families but thrilled editors chasing audience engagement. On morning shows in Britain, the Carters gave interviews, their voices trembling as they described Ben's playful texts, his last Instagram story, his unfulfilled plans. Susan Foster became a reluctant spokesperson for grieving parents globally, lambasting investigators who, in her words, stop counting when the tourists go home. Social media became a double-edged sword for the grieving families. On one hand, tens of thousands of strangers offered condolences, art, poems, and digital tributes. A GoFundMe page in Emily's name hit its initial goal in less than a day. On the other, conspiracy theorists, and the merely bored, descended, twisting every leaked document or camera still for clicks. Members of both families were hounded by tabloid journalists. Relatives received anonymous threats. Acquaintances from middle school were tracked down for background quotes. Even when the families attempted to grieve privately, helicopters trawled overhead and camera flashes followed their cars leaving the coroner's office. At the investigation's heart, the Fosters and Carters were often left adrift. Legal roadblocks and unfamiliar procedures forced them to hire advisors in both the US and UK. The process of repatriating Ben's body was slowed for weeks by wrangling over evidence. Emily's personal effects were nearly lost in the bureaucratic shuffle before public outcry forced action. Each call with the authorities brought fresh confusion or contradiction. Were the suspects' confessions genuine? Did local politics cloud the search for the truth? Were critical clues missed because the investigation was chaotically overrun from the start? Community response on Shell Island itself was complicated. While some locals organized candlelight vigils, others resented the disruption, blaming outsiders for the unwanted scrutiny. A vocal minority insisted the tragedy threatened their livelihoods far more than any risk of crime. Resentment simmered at the implication that residents might be complicit or negligent. Business owners formed a tourism coalition to lobby for positive press and protective statements from law enforcement. Against this backdrop, political figures and activists seized on the case to advance broader causes: immigration issues, police reform in tourist destinations, international justice standards. The British Foreign Office and U.S. State Department issued joint statements demanding answers. Petitions circulated calling for an independent review. Outside the police station, demonstrators appeared with signs, some demanding justice for Emily and Ben, others protesting what they saw as xenophobic scapegoating of the accused men. The island split into camps, each certain that only their theory preserved its fragile sense of justice. As the legal drama unfolded, both families were thrust into unfamiliar roles, not simply as bereaved parents and siblings, but as reluctant symbols in overlapping debates about victimhood, travel safety, and accountability across borders. The Carters and Fosters endured cross-examinations by insurance adjusters, victims' rights groups, and international press corps. They coordinated candlelight memorials streamed live, thousands tuning in across time zones, while trying to shield surviving relatives from paparazzi and online trolls. The months following the tragedy revealed a deep and enduring trauma that transcended the boundaries of Shell Island. Both families reported chronic harassment and months of sleeplessness. Emily's older brother withdrew from law school to support his parents. Ben's best friend wrote a guest editorial pleading for dignity and patience in the public sphere. The swirl of rumor and counter-rumor seemed endless. Each new leak or twist in the case resurrected fresh pain, adding layers to a loss that would never have the clean lines of popular, true crime fiction. When the trial began, the families sat together in the courtroom's front row, staring down local officials, the accused, and battery of international press. Susan Foster, exhausted but resolute, delivered a statement directly to the jury. "We came here as tourists once, dreaming of sun and safety. We leave as witnesses to how easily a dream can turn into heartbreak, and how important it is that justice not be an afterthought." Through it all, Emily and Ben's stories continued to echo in public memory. Friends posted photos along with stories of their laughter and kindness. Scholarships and beach cleanups were founded in their names. But the answers the families sought, why their children died, who was ultimately responsible, and what could have prevented it, remained elusive, buried under competing claims, procedural tangle, and the enduring ambiguity of justice in a place where paradise and peril were always separated by the thinnest of lines. Court hearings, disputes, and unresolved mysteries. As the months dragged into a year following the Shell Island tragedy, all eyes remained fixated on the Grand Courthouse across the narrow causeway. On the outside, the building was a study in old Florida charm, peeling white columns, huge nothing-ever-happens-here verandas, but inside it throbbed with an energy akin to a powder keg. Even before opening statements, picketers lined the tropical garden walkways every morning, some with photos of Emily and Ben on cardboard hearts, others raising banners decrying scapegoating and botched justice. At the center of it all stood the two accused Cuban kitchen workers, Ortega and Martinez, their futures, and perhaps the reputation of the entire island, balanced on a knife's edge. The trial was nothing like the swift, clean process that many pundits demanded. Instead, it unspooled with a slowness bordering on painful. For the prosecution, the case seemed airtight. After all, there were confessions, apparent DNA matches, and at least circumstantial testimony tying both men to the scene. State attorneys leaned heavily on the confessions, replaying police audio and translating transcripts for the jury. In the gallery, the families of the victims flinched at each dry recitation, their grief rippling through the room. The prosecutor described a crime of opportunity, painting the suspects as boiling over from a petty provocation into deadly violence. Each grim detail, the pattern of blows, the torn fabric, the agonizing final text messages, was put under the microscope, as if logic alone could force sense from senselessness. But the defense was nothing if not relentless. From the outset, defense counsel raised pointed questions about the voluntariness of the confessions. They detailed the hours-long interrogations, gaps in clear legal counsel, and the pitfalls of cross-language translation. Drawing from expert testimony, the defense highlighted research on false confessions, especially among second-language speakers under tremendous pressure. At times, interpreters themselves took the stand, laboriously recounting exchanges word by word as the courtroom struggled with the dizzying dance of linguistics, legal nuance, and sheer human exhaustion. The defense also hammered on what they characterized as contamination and confusion at the crime scene, trampled evidence, mishandled items, and a timeline riddled with inconsistencies. Tensions inside the courtroom oscillated between barely restrained outrage and raw heartbreak. While jurors were ordered not to browse news or Facebook, a low buzz of rumor still seeped in each day. Some days the protests outside grew so loud that proceedings paused until order could be restored. Journalists tweeted every new exchange in real time, shock over a misattributed DNA marker, gasps when a new witness claimed to have seen a hooded figure running away from the beach at exactly 3:20 a.m., discomfort as autopsy photographs flickered on the projection screen. Tabloid coverage in both the US and the UK fixated on every teardrop, every trembling voice, every tremor of doubt in the narrative. Clandestine podcasts dissected the proceedings while true crime aficionados mapped out possible timelines on Reddit, sometimes outpacing the actual investigation in their ingenuity or their recklessness. What pulled the trial far from routine weren't just legal arguments, but the layers of uncertainty piled on with every witness. Resort security personnel contradicted each other about camera outages and access logs. A local bartender hesitated, revising her memory under oath. Was it Martinez she saw outside the Blue Palm bar or another guest with the same build? The digital forensics expert, flown in from Miami, struggled to explain missing timestamps and partial data recovery, leading one juror to audibly sigh. Most perplexing of all were the items that no one could account for: the silver locket and its mysterious faded photograph, the hotel keycard booked under a false name, the sequence of posthumous text messages received on Ben Carter's phone after the murders. As the defense called its own witnesses, other kitchen workers, out-of-town tourists, even a forensic linguist specializing in Spanish and English translation, fresh ambiguities surfaced. Was it possible, the linguist posited, that entire confessions could have shifted meaning through mistranslation of just a verb tense or an incomplete idiom? A young housekeeper delivered a tearful account of seeing two men, neither matching the accused, hurrying down the beachside trail while she collected towels in the pre-dawn gloom. Each new voice seemed to muddy, not clarify, the waters. Public outcry flared anew when the prosecution attempted to introduce a series of speculative photographs scraped from Facebook and Instagram, hoping to tie partygoers' timelines to shadowy background figures. The judge sharply rebuked both sides more than once for theatrics and attempts to sway the court with conjecture. Even so, every new day of testimony shone a spotlight on the daunting complexity at the heart of the case, a swirl of conflicting identities, languages, and motives washed over by tides of rumor, fear, and desperate need for closure. In a moment that would define the trial for many, a third-party crime scene expert, quiet, gray-haired, methodical, was called by the defense. He explained in painstaking detail how the handling of footprints, cigarette butts, and clothing residue had potentially destroyed evidence crucial to distinguishing strangers from the accused. "You don't just fight a human adversary here," he intoned. "You're against time, nature, the sea, and a tidal wave of tourists." As he presented photo slides of beach sand churned by hundreds of flip-flop and shoe prints, the courtroom seemed to collectively internalize how fragile certainty really was. By the time closing arguments arrived after months of bitter back and forth, the community, and the international media with it, was exhausted. No testimony had produced a clear, irrefutable sequence of the night's events. What remained were fractured truths and wounds that crossed borders and divided loyalties. The prosecution urged the jury not to be swayed by exotic theories or romantic ideas of innocence, and stressed the rarity of DNA coincidences. The defense implored the jury to weigh doubt over prejudice, to imagine the terror of being a vulnerable outsider facing a machinery desperate to convict. The jury deliberated for days. Finally, in a verdict that would satisfy no one fully, Ortega and Martinez were found guilty of lesser charges, unlawful manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. The headlines were immediate and polarizing. "Justice at last," claimed one daily. "Still no answers for Shell Island," countered another. Protesters hugged, wept, shouted, and social media lit up with recriminations and wild counter-theories, but far from closing the book, the trial's aftermath seemed to only fan the embers of mystery. In the months that followed, rumors spread of suspicious accidents, uneasy witnesses, and even warnings whispered to journalists. Shell Island's reputation as a paradise now seemed irrevocably entwined with a sense of something unfinished, haunted. Families of the victims grieved, but did not let go. Annual vigils were held on the anniversary of the murder, demanding further inquiry. Civil liberties groups pressed for new reviews, and lawyers continued to appeal in the hope that fresh evidence might someday surface. Even as tourists gradually returned, the darkness refused to fade. Bloggers and documentary crews descended on Shell Island, retracing steps and offering new, sometimes outlandish suspicions: organized crime, a blackmailed love triangle, corruption in the local police. Retired officers gave interviews in dim studios, hinting that what had emerged in court was but a fraction of the whole story. Each year, newfound details or the smallest leaks of investigative files were seized as proof. One more blue thread in an ever-growing tapestry of fear and fascination. For the Shell Island community, the legacy of the trial was lasting unease. Restaurants once known for sunset toasts now hosted whispered tales and wary glances. Resort owners quietly hired private security, and the local PD purchased new forensic kits funded through grant money granted not for safety, but for reassurance. The courthouse itself became a symbol in the ongoing debate over whether truth, in a place so given to fantasy, could ever prevail against coincidence and myth. If you walked the western beach as fog crept in before sunrise, careful not to disturb memorial crosses or the faded ribbons still tied to sea oats, you'd sense it too. The island's story wasn't over. The verdict, the controversies, and the enduring aching mysteries hung in the salt air, a warning and a riddle inseparable from the promise and peril of paradise found and forever marked. Shell Island, a wound in the heart of a tourist paradise. Shell Island, once the shining emblem of Florida's untouched tropical beauty and carefree nightlife, would never quite recover from the events of 2014. In the collective memory of residents, the trauma carved out by that summer's violence lingered among the swaying palms and pastel sunsets, stubbornly resisting every attempt to restore the island's simpler days. Even as time wore on, the place felt changed, haunted by undercurrents of suspicion, sorrow, and the knowledge that darkness could slip silently beneath the surface of sunlit paradise. The initial weeks after the tragedy saw a brief but dramatic downturn in tourism. Travel blogs, usually brimming with filtered snapshots of emerald lagoons, started whispering warning tales. Mainstream travel advisories updated their listings with understated cautions about recent events, while major resort chains rushed to reassure guests with promises of heightened security and smiling, ever-present staff. For the first time in living memory, the local economy felt fragile. Boat tour operators, ice cream vendors, and beachfront bartenders watched reservations vanish, tip jars empty, and schedules trimmed to skeleton crews. Tour guides who once relished the chance to play ambassador were now reluctant to field uneasy questions about the crime and its aftermath. Yet, as the weeks drifted into months and new seasons came, the island gradually pulsed back to life, albeit with a new rhythm. Some visitors, lovers of the remote and the macabre, arrived with curiosity piqued by the story. They traced the old party trails or took snapshots near the infamous cove, their presence both an economic boon and a subtle reminder of unresolved wounds. Local elders began to shape new legends, alternating between cautionary tales meant to ward off late-night trespassers and wistful stories of pre-crime Shell Island, hoping to recommission the past as armor against the persistent shadows. Community efforts to mend the island's reputation slowly grew. Annual beach cleanups were held in memory of the victims, drawing volunteers from far and wide who saw an act of service as a stand against the narrative of helplessness. Artists painted murals along the marina, blending images of dolphins, sunbursts, and the initials of Emily and Ben into living memorials. Town meetings, once sleepy and routine, now bristled with debate over proposed curfews, surveillance initiatives, and how much of the island's soul could be traded for peace of mind. But the return to normal was at best partial. For every traveler lounging under an umbrella, there was a neighbor who locked their doors at dusk and looked twice at every unfamiliar face. The staff at local eateries sometimes dropped their voices when discussing late shifts. Teenagers who once held bonfires near the Western Rocks quietly shifted their gatherings elsewhere, swapping ghost stories for stern warnings not to tempt fate. The scarlet mark of tragedy, invisible yet unmistakable, lingered in the way locals bristled at media inquiries, shielded children from the press, and comforted one another on the anniversary of that terrible night. The crime's echoes shaped not just how outsiders perceived Shell Island, but how the community viewed itself. Distrust flared between longtime residents and newcomers, between business owners and the authorities, and most of all, toward the flow of tourists whose dollars both sustained and imperiled island life. Some businesses doubled down on safety, advertising private bungalows and controlled access, while others closed up for good, unable or unwilling to weather the lingering cloud of speculation. Neighborhood associations established island guardians, a step somewhere between watch groups and folklore, intent on keeping paradise unsullied by repetition of misfortune. In the broader sense, Shell Island came to symbolize the fragile balance faced by countless so-called paradises around the world. How much risk could be tolerated for the sake of openness? What wounds heal, and which become part of the landscape? For every tale told in bars or over family dinners, some earnest, some exaggerated, there was an unspoken understanding that innocence, once gone, rarely returns in full. This sense was felt most sharply on moonlit nights, when the beach was empty, but for the sound of waves, and even the bravest resident found themselves pausing to look back over their shoulder. By the time the decade closed, Shell Island had started to attract a new breed of visitor, true crime enthusiasts, documentarians, and amateur sleuths eager to reconstruct the events of 2014. Walking tours, frowned upon by many locals, sprang up alongside traditional nature walks, sparking arguments about taste, memory, and exploitation. Some islanders railed against the commodification of their pain, while others accepted the stranger economy as part of the island's strange new identity. Paradise lost, some would mutter. Others argued that the island's survival, even in bruised form, was its own kind of resilience. Through it all, Shell Island's natural beauty endured, just altered by the layers of narrative that had settled atop its beaches. Storms still swept in from the Gulf, carving fresh patterns into the dunes. Sea turtles nested in the same soft sand, and dolphins sometimes leaped close to shore, undeterred by human sorrow and rumor. Children born after the tragedy grew up listening to dueling stories about why the old path along the Western Rocks was bad luck, each tale colored by the teller's need for meaning, or reassurance that such things could never happen again. For all its resilience, however, the island's collective heart bore the wound. Annual commemorations became part of the island calendar, drawing together those marked by loss, those searching for new beginnings, and those simply unwilling to look away. Across generations, the story of what happened on Shell Island was neither buried nor fully told. Instead, it became inseparable from the place itself, a reminder of vulnerability amid beauty, and of the long, uncertain path from heartbreak back to hope.